The U.S. Fish and Wildlife agent's voice was dead calm as she explained to HOA President Victoria Ashford Chen exactly how many federal laws she'd violated. "Ma'am, you ordered the destruction of 14 federally endangered plant species. That's 14 separate violations of the Endangered Species Act, each carrying potential fines of $50,000 and up to 1 year imprisonment." Victoria's perfectly styled red suit jacket seemed to lose its power as the color drained from her face. Her platinum blonde curls, usually bouncing with entitled confidence, hung limp as she realized the weeds she demanded I remove were worth more than her entire house. Just 8 hours earlier, this woman had stood in my front yard with a landscaping crew, ready to rip out 3 years of federally funded botanical research because my native prairie restoration didn't match her vision of suburban perfection. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just some eccentric homeowner with an overgrown yard. I was Dr. Sarah Whitmore, lead botanist for the Texas Native Species Conservation Project, and my weeds were part of a $380,000 federal grant studying endangered plant propagation. If you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen who thought she knew more than actual experts, you're going to love this. Drop a comment with your location because I need to know if plant-destroying HOAs are terrorizing scientists where you're watching from. Let me set the scene. After 12 years working for the University of Texas at Austin's Department of Integrative Biology, I'd finally secured my dream project, a long-term study on propagating endangered native Texas plant species for ecosystem restoration. The grant required establishing test plots in different soil conditions. I'd strategically purchased my home in Willow Creek Estates, specifically because the property had 3 distinct soil types: clay, loam, and sandy, perfect for comparative growth studies. My half-acre lot had been transformed into what looked like organized chaos to the untrained eye, but was actually a meticulously documented research garden. 14 species of endangered plants, each with GPS-marked locations, soil sensors, growth tracking equipment, and protective netting to prevent herbivore damage. Species like Texas trailing phlox, Navasota lady's tresses orchid, South Texas ambrosia, and Texas poppy mallow plants so rare that damaging them was a federal crime. Each plant represented months of careful propagation, genetic documentation, and survival rate monitoring. The research plot was marked with small identification stakes, had dedicated irrigation zones, and was documented with weekly photo surveys uploaded to the federal database. Everything was legitimate, licensed, and legally protected under the Endangered Species Act. My immediate neighbors understood and were fascinated. I'd given presentations at the local elementary school about native plants. Kids would visit to see the rare species. It was community education meets scientific research. Then Victoria Ashford Chen noticed my yard didn't look like the HOA-approved Kentucky bluegrass monoculture everyone else maintained. She appeared on a Tuesday morning in late April, when my spring species were at peak bloom, a riot of purple, yellow, and white flowers that most suburbanites would call wildflowers, but botanists recognized as increasingly rare native species. Victoria was impossible to ignore. Late 50s, with elaborately curled platinum blonde hair that defied Texas humidity through what had to be industrial-strength products. She wore a bright cherry red blazer over a white silk shell, with pressed black slacks and heels that sank into my carefully maintained native soil. Her jewelry was aggressive chunky gold necklace, matching bracelet, and rings that probably cost more than my microscope. Everything about her screamed, "I've never been told no and don't plan to start now. You must be the new resident with the weed problem," she announced without introduction, surveying my research plot like it was a crime scene. I was on my knees, carefully documenting the root structure of a particularly successful Texas poppy mallow specimen, Dr. Sarah Whitmore. And this isn't a weed problem. It's a federally funded research project on endangered species propagation. She laughed, actually laughed. Honey, I don't care what you call it. Your yard violates Section 8.2 of our landscaping covenants. Grass must be maintained at 2 to 3 inches. No wildflowers, except in designated flower beds, and absolutely no natural or prairie-style landscaping. I stood up, dusting soil from my jeans. Section 8.2 doesn't override federal environmental protection laws. These plants are protected under the Endangered Species Act. I have permits from both Fish and Wildlife Service and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Victoria's smile turned venomous. Federal permits don't supersede HOA authority within our community. I suggest you read your closing documents more carefully. She produced an iPad and showed me photos of my property taken from the street. 14 violations documented. Your yard is a public nuisance, attracting insects and creating fire hazards with all this dead-looking vegetation. That dead-looking vegetation is dormant perennial growth, I explained, keeping my voice professional. It's how native plants survive drought conditions. And the insects are pollinators, butterflies, native bees, and moths that are also experiencing population decline. I don't care about your bugs, Victoria snapped. You have 72 hours to remove all non-conforming vegetation and install approved landscaping. After that, fines are $500 per day, compounding weekly. She handed me a pre-printed violation notice with my address already filled in. They'd planned this ambush. One more thing, she added, her voice dripping with false sweetness. The Architectural Review Committee meets monthly. If you'd like to propose a small flower bed with approved species, you're welcome to submit an application. For a $250 review fee, of course. Then she walked away, heels clicking on my driveway, leaving divots in the gravel. I stood there holding her violation notice, my scientist brain already cataloging the multiple levels of illegal overreach she'd just attempted. Day 2 brought escalation. At 7 a.m., a landscaping truck pulled up. 3 workers emerged with string trimmers, shovels, and what looked like herbicide sprayers. I ran outside in my bathrobe. "What are you doing?" The crew chief, looking uncomfortable, showed me a work order. HOA hired us for emergency weed abatement. We're supposed to clear everything in lay sod. Those aren't weeds. They're federally protected endangered species. If you damage them, you're committing federal crimes. The crew chief's eyes went wide. "Lady, we're just doing what we were hired for. I understand. But I need to show you something." I pulled out my phone and showed him my fish and wildlife permits. The GP Smart species locations and photos of the identification stakes clearly visible throughout the yard. See those orange flags? Each one marks an endangered plant. Damaging them violates the Endangered Species Act. Fines start at $50,000 per species. The crew chief took one look at the permits, then at my yard full of orange marker flags, and made a decision. We're leaving. We're not risking federal charges for an HOA contract. They packed up and drove away, leaving Victoria's Range Rover screeching into my driveway minutes later. She must have been monitoring from nearby. "You threaten my contractors," she shrieked, her red blazer practically vibrating with rage. Her curled blonde hair was bouncing with each word. "I informed them they were about to commit federal crimes," I corrected. "There's a difference. Those are weeds, not endangered species. You're making this up to avoid compliance." I pulled out my tablet and showed her the federal database. Each plant in my yard was registered with GPS coordinates, species identification, genetic documentation, and monthly growth reports. The data was uploaded to servers maintained by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. "This is a recognized research site," I explained. "Destroying these plants would invalidate 3 years of data collection and potentially harm species. Recovery efforts for plants that exist in fewer than 50 locations statewide." Victoria's face cycled through emotions, anger, disbelief, and then calculating determination. I'll be filing a formal complaint with your university. We'll see what they think about you using neighborhood property for unauthorized research. It's not neighborhood property, it's my property. And the research is fully authorized with permits from multiple agencies. But please do contact UT, Austin. Dr. Patricia Morrison in the Department of Integrative Biology would love to discuss the project. That made her pause. Dr. Morrison was notorious in Austin academic circles, brilliant, ruthless when protecting her researchers, and with connections throughout state government. But Victoria wasn't done. Fine. We'll see what the city code enforcement thinks about your fire hazard. Day 3 brought what I'd expected, a parade of inspectors. First came someone claiming to be from the fire marshal's office, citing fire fuel concerns. I asked for his credentials. He stammered, couldn't produce official ID, and left when I started photographing him. Then, a city code enforcement officer who didn't know which department he supposedly worked for and whose badge number didn't match the format used by Austin. Finally, a Texas Parks and Wildlife officer who couldn't answer basic questions about native plant identification and whose uniform had incorrect patches. Victoria was hiring actors, sending them to intimidate me with fake authority. It would have been funny if it wasn't so desperately illegal. That evening, I called my grant administrator, Dr. Janet Chun, at the National Science Foundation. I need to document HOA interference with federally funded research. How bad is the interference? Janet asked. I told her everything: the violation notices, the attempted destruction, the fake inspectors. Sarah, this is serious. Interference with federal research is a crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 1505. I'm notifying our legal team and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office of Law Enforcement. They'll want to investigate. The HOA president threatened to have the plants destroyed, I added. I have it recorded. Send me everything. Recordings, permits, documentation of interference. The federal government takes protection of endangered species very seriously, especially when it's connected to grant-funded research. Within 24 hours, I had 2 federal agents assigned to my case: Special Agent Lisa Marino from Fish and Wildlife Law Enforcement and Dr. Robert Chang from the NSF Office of Inspector General. They reviewed my documentation, inspected the research plot, verified all permits, and confirmed that Victoria's attempted destruction constituted multiple federal violations. Dr. Whitmore, Agent Marino said, "We're going to pay a visit to your HOA president. Would you like to be present?" Absolutely. Agent Marino arranged a meeting at Victoria's house, not revealing it was a federal investigation. Victoria agreed, probably thinking it was another opportunity to complain about my yard. I watched from Agent Marino's vehicle as Victoria opened her door, dressed in full combat regalia, the red blazer, the curls, the jewelry. She clearly expected to intimidate whoever was coming. Her face when she saw federal credentials was priceless. "Victoria Ashford Chun?" Agent Marino asked, her badge prominently displayed. "I'm Special Agent Lisa Marino with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement. We need to discuss your interactions with Dr. Sarah Whitmore's federally protected research site." Victoria's confident smile faltered. This is just an HOA landscaping issue. Why is federal law enforcement involved?" "Because you've threatened to destroy endangered species protected under the Endangered Species Act," Agent Marino replied, pulling out documentation. "You've also interfered with federally funded scientific research, which violates multiple statutes." I stepped out of the vehicle then, carrying my research documentation. Victoria's face went from confused to furious when she saw me. "You called federal agents on me? Over weeds?" "Over 14 endangered species worth approximately $80,000 in research value and 3 years of irreplaceable data," I corrected. "Each plant you threaten to destroy carries potential fines of $50,000 under the Endangered Species Act." Agent Marino laid out the case methodically. Ms. Ashford-Chun, we have recordings of you threatening to destroy protected species. We have documentation of you hiring contractors to remove endangered plants. We have evidence of you sending fake inspectors to Dr. Whitmore's property to harass her into compliance with illegal demands. Just plants, Victoria protested. They look like weeds. They're federally protected endangered species, Dr. Chang interjected. He was the NSF investigator, a mild-mannered man who spoke with devastating precision. Dr. Whitmore's research is funded by a $380,000 federal grant. Her work has already resulted in 2 peer-reviewed publications on propagation techniques that may prevent species extinction. Your interferences threaten that research. Victoria's platinum curls seemed to deflate. I didn't know ... You were told repeatedly, I said. I showed you permits. I explained the federal protections. You chose to ignore expert testimony because you cared more about lawn aesthetics than environmental law. Agent Marino delivered the final blow. You're facing potential charges under the Endangered Species Act, interference with federal research, and conspiracy to violate federal environmental statutes. The U.S. Attorney's Office will determine whether to prosecute. Victoria collapsed onto her porch steps, the red blazer that had once symbolized her authority now just looking garish against her pale face. What do I do? She whispered. First, you resign from the HOA board, I said. Second, you issue a written apology and retraction of all violations against my property. Third, you pay for an environmental consultant to assess whether any damage was done during your contractor's initial visit. And fourth, you never interfere with legitimate scientific research again. Agent Marino added, those are Dr. Whitmore's terms. The federal charges are still under review. I suggest you comply fully and hope the U.S. Attorney's Office shows leniency. Victoria resigned from the HOA board that week. A written apology was distributed to all Willow Creek Estates residents, explaining that she had misunderstood the nature of Dr. Whitmore's landscaping and that the property was actually a federally protected research site. The new HOA board immediately updated the CC and RS to explicitly exempt scientific research, native plant landscaping, and any federally permitted activities from landscaping restrictions. My research continued uninterrupted. In fact, the publicity brought more attention to the project. Local news covered the story, and suddenly I had elementary schools, gardening clubs, and environmental groups requesting tours of the endangered species garden. The plants thrived. My data on propagation techniques led to 3 more publications and a successful grant renewal. Several of the species I propagated were successfully transplanted to restoration sites across Texas. Victoria was never formally charged. The U.S. Attorney's Office determined her cooperation and public humiliation were sufficient punishment. But her reputation in the community was destroyed. She moved away 6 months later. The environmental consultant's assessment found minimal damage from the contractor's initial visit, but my grant covered the costs of additional monitoring to ensure no long-term harm. Today, my research garden is a certified National Wildlife Federation habitat and an official U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service monitoring site. It's marked on federal maps as a protected research location. My half-acre yard doesn't look like my neighbor's perfect lawns. It looks like what Texas looked like before suburban sprawl, diverse, native, alive with pollinators and wildlife that depend on these increasingly rare plants. Every spring, when the endangered species bloom in riots of color that most people would call weeds, I think about Victoria in her red blazer, so certain that her aesthetic preferences trumped environmental law and scientific research. She learned what every HOA tyrant eventually learns. Expertise matters. Federal law supersedes HOA rules, and some weeds are worth more than suburban conformity. Your HOA Karen thinks she knows better than scientists, lawyers, and federal agents combined. She weaponized landscaping rules to force conformity, never stopping to consider that maybe, just maybe, the person she's targeting actually knows what they're doing. Victoria saw native plants and assumed ignorance. She never considered that my messy yard was actually worth $80,000 in research funding and 3 years of data collection that could help prevent species extinction. Knowledge backed by federal permits and endangered species protections is unstoppable. HOA rules don't override environmental law. Aesthetic preferences don't trump scientific research. And calling plants weeds doesn't change their protected status. Have you dealt with an HOA that tried to enforce landscaping rules against legitimate scientific, environmental, or agricultural activities? Share your story in the comments. Hit that subscribe button for more stories about HO, tyrants who learned that expertise and federal law beat entitled ignorance every time.